while this number of vulnerabilities is like rapidly going up, that actually means that the WordPress ecosystem is getting more secure. These vulnerabilities have been there for a very long time. It's just that nobody else was like really looking for it, and the ones that were looking for it for another reason, taking over websites and using it to, host malware and things like that. Hello, everyone. Nice to have you all here. So I guess every one of you, or like many of you, have had at least some sort of exposure to WordPress, whether it's a company website, whether it's something that you're hosting in your servers, something that you help some of your friends out with when they need assistance with their website, for example. WordPress is powering pretty much very big part of the internet at this point, so it's very important to also talk about security here. Before that, quick background about myself. Have around 10 years of experience in WordPress security. Actually started off working on different content management systems like Joomla, but essentially working on web application security in general. And in terms of our company, half of our people are actually security researchers, so we're very much focused as a threat intelligence cybersecurity company. We are also one of the official CNAs that have given the authorization to assign CVE IDs to WordPress-related products, which means that we assign CVEs for WordPress core, plugin, and theme vulnerabilities. But because WordPress ecosystem is so vast, then we've also happened to be the largest vulnerability processor in the world in general. Last year, I believe we processed around 4,000 CVEs alone. So that obviously requires a lot of internal processes, a lot of smooth kind of like systems to be able to kind of go over that kind of volume. And of course, what our core business is that we provide automatic vulnerability mitigation for WordPress and for other content management systems. So our focus really is to increase the speed of mitigation of security vulnerabilities. So if you find something that is affecting, let's say, hundreds of thousands of websites, a single vulnerability that affects hundreds of thousands of websites, then we want to make sure that even if the developers have not been able to go and like release an update or anything like that, we would be able to reduce that exposure timeline and make sure that the websites are actually safe. And we work together with many of the largest hosting companies, but also smaller ones, but we also work with other security companies in the ecosystem as well, where we provide the kind of like the core vulnerability management and mitigation layer. So on Friday, we actually released our annual white paper called the State of WordPress Security. We cover essentially all of the data from 2024. We look into like what are the trends, what the vulnerabilities look like. In the end on the last slide, you will have a QR code where you can actually see or get access to that white paper. But if we look into 2024, on average, there was like 22 new security vulnerabilities being disclosed, which means published every single day. The total number of security vulnerabilities that we were publishing on our data set was 7,966. And if we look into like kind of like comparing that with the previous years, there was 34% increase compared to 2023. But actually, I also added here the statistics from 2020. And why it's important is because in 2020, we announced something called Patchstack Alliance, which essentially is a community of ethical hackers who we reward for finding security vulnerabilities in open source components. So they find security issues in any of those 60,000 WordPress plugins, and if they report to us, and we can coordinate the disclosure process in an ethical manner, making sure that developers are kind of capable of fixing those issues before the vulnerabilities are being published to the wild, then we basically pay them money, right? So since of that moment, the number of vulnerabilities that we've been managing to kind of like iron out from the entire WordPress ecosystem has risen over 1,000%. So it's a lot of like community effort, and I think what is important also to mention here is that while this number of vulnerabilities is like rapidly going up, that actually means that the WordPress ecosystem is getting more secure. these vulnerabilities have been there for a very long time. It's just that nobody else was like really looking for it, and the ones that were looking for it for another reason, not for patching, but more like taking over websites and using it to host malware and things like that. Out of all of those vulnerabilities, when we look into where they are being found from, it's like 99.9% is actually coming from plugins and themes. I believe it was like 94% that was actually from plugins, and then there was a few percentages that were coming from the themes. But like WordPress core itself only included 7 security fixes this year. And all of them were very low severity in that sense where, for an attacker to kind of like make use of those vulnerabilities in like automated like exploitation campaigns was not very helpful in that regard. So we didn't see any mass exploitations against WordPress core itself, which I think shows that WordPress core is a very mature product. It's kind of like, there's a lot of eyes that has gone over the platform, and WordPress core itself is very secure. But where we need to put a lot more attention to is specifically plugins and themes, which can be developed by anyone, and that includes AI, which we're going to get into later. The impact obviously is very undeniable when we look into why websites are getting hacked in the first place in the WordPress ecosystem. On the white paper, we actually partnered up with the GoDaddy-owned security company called Sucuri. So they analyzed all the malware side of the things, like what were the reasons why websites were getting hacked, what the hackers were doing with the websites, and what we kind of like looked into is like they, I believe, monitored around 500,000 websites that were infected into 2024. That's like quite a lot of websites that were getting hit. And in terms of the data, when we see what are the main causes of websites being hacked is everything related to user hygiene. So, lost session cookies because the devices that they are using to access the websites are basically infected with keyloggers and malware that is basically trying to get access to the session cookies. Obviously, very poor password management in terms of using like admin and pizza123 passwords, which by the way, a government website did. And then, like these are the kind of like the main reasons why it happens, and then half of it is pretty much like, security vulnerabilities within plugins and themes, what our talk is a little bit more focused on. 1,018 vulnerabilities actually affected plugins that had 100,000 plus active installations. So a hacker just needs to find one vulnerability in such a plugin and basically have the potential access to 100,000 websites at once. So this is like something that you can really well script and kind of like fully automate to take over those websites. And what we also saw that the new vulnerabilities were very quickly weaponized. So in a matter of 2 hours, like when a vulnerability is getting disclosed, we call it like a one-day vulnerabilities when they're patched and then they're disclosed. And then the hackers are essentially just like looking to bombard the websites before the users have had time to essentially go and update the software underneath it. So they try to like weaponize it as fast as possible, and this number is like getting shorter and shorter. And those websites are being used to spread malware. They kind of like use different tactics to kind of like inject it with SEO spam. They also inject it with kind of like pop-ups that are trying to tell you that your browser needs updating, and then they can, install basically keyloggers to your computer, like fake browser widgets and things like that, which essentially give them access to the session cookies to other stuff where you're logged into. Same applies to credit card details. So very common malware is that you inject it into e-commerce shops, which is essentially a keylogger on top of our website, which kind of like records all the keystrokes that the customers are putting in there, including all the credit card details when they're doing a checkout. And something that we've really noticed is like the kind of like traditional security measures just don't cut it anymore. Like WordPress is more than 20 years old, and we've always had security solutions available, which have mostly been focused on kind of like malware cleanups. And I think WordPress is also the kind of like the only ecosystem where malware cleanup is like a security feature, which is kind of like showing how hyper-normalized the fact is that the websites are just getting hacked all of the time. Updates is not something that is clearly kind of like helping you to stay safe, because when we look into our data from the white paper, 33% of the vulnerabilities never receive a patch. So there's a lot of WordPress kind of like plugins and themes that are kind of abandoned as well. And generic WAFs have also proven to be ineffective. We have a very good example that we laid out also on the white paper, where we specifically looked into one of a very popular page builder, which was having remote code execution vulnerability found in early 2024. And we talked to hosting companies who had like multiple layers of WAFs, like on the network level, server level, and so forth. And the problem is that you don't have a proper visibility into how the application is made of. So you're kind of like relying on generic rule sets, which are very well kind of like optimized for just like lower amount of false positives. And that means that those very specific vulnerabilities that can be affecting WordPress applications are just kind of like going undetected. And when we're talking about 7,000 or like almost 8,000 vulnerabilities per year, that's a lot of threat intelligence that you need to invest into to be able to protect those websites in a very precise way. And another thing, what we've kind of like looked into is like when we think about malware scanning, and then there's a lot of like WordPress security plugins that do kind of like malware scanning for the websites, and something that is becoming more and more common is that the first thing that hackers are doing when they're infecting a website with malware is that malware is looking for the contents of the server and seeing whether there's like malware scanners present, and then they just whitelist itself, which is like creating another problem where companies that have like, let's say, purchased like a premium security solution that does malware scanning for them, now they rely on that software that they would feel more secure, and it gives them like false feeling of security because they think that they think that everything is clean because that malware scanner is showing that everything is clean. But the reality is that the malware that was infected injected into the website, the first thing it did was essentially just kind of whitelist itself. So in terms of malware scanning, that also includes backups. That actually is something that everyone should get from the hosting level. So where you control either backups or if you control the malware scanning process, this should not be in the same environment where you're kind of controlling it. So the malware scanner itself should not get compromised, right? And yeah, so how can we kind of like keep the website safe and like the servers clean? Like when we've talked to our hosting partners, up to like 70% of the websites that they're hosting is WordPress. So obviously this is like a massive problem also for the hosting companies, because you get like inquiries about customers who have their websites hacked, your servers are being used for all kinds of criminal activity and so forth. So what we can really do about it, right? So I think one of the main key things that I haven't like seen done a lot is that we need to really be honest about like who owns the responsibility in terms of the website security. Like we see a lot of hosting companies go after like, today everyone is like saying that they have a secure WordPress hosting, for example, or like when we talk about managed WordPress hosting specifically. But what they do underneath it is always different. And for the customers, what it means is that it's just they think that like all this responsibility is kind of like pushed on the hosting side, but in the reality, they're responsible. Like when they host a WordPress site and when they decide what kind of plugins and themes and like what kind of components they install there, that's actually their responsibility to take care of that application that they choose to host on that infrastructure. So if those customers don't even know that they have a problem because they feel like everything is managed by them, then there's no way for them to actually also improve in terms of having more secure applications hosted in those servers. So instead of like kind of like what we've seen, like malware scanning being like a paid fee or like a premium feature of a hosting service, I think we need to be a little bit more proactive and figure out the ways how the hackers are actually getting to those sites in the first place, and making sure that we have solutions in place that are reducing that number significantly, which can also reduce the numbers of customer kind of like reaching out to you and having those tough discussions when the sites are used for kind of all kinds of weird ways, including spreading malware. Something we always kind of, again, do in this white paper is think a little bit about like, okay, we know the data, what we see from 2024, but where are we heading? Like, what's the direction that we are going at? And something that we already started seeing last year is that the AI is going to play a little bit of like, it's kind of like a double-edged sword right now. We see a lot of developers using AI now. So WordPress ecosystem in general has always been kind of like a non-techie, it's very easy to get like into it. If you want to build like a functional website, you can use plugins. So now we're getting into a situation where those same people can also use AI to kind of like build those functionalities or even build plugins. To the point where we actually saw a situation where there was a security plugin released to the ecosystem, which we looked into and was very suspicious, and then it turned out it was completely AI generated, and it was essentially pointing to WordPress functions that didn't even exist. So in the short term, we're definitely going to see a lot of security vulnerabilities being introduced by AI coding or vibe coding, or however you want to call it, because the people who are pushing out that code, they don't necessarily care about what is happening on the technical layer, or they don't even have the capability of understanding what is happening on the technical layer, and they just look into like whether this is visually functional or not. And the second thing is that hackers need to really weaponize the vulnerabilities as fast as possible before the users have been able to update. And this is something that AI is helping them a lot as well. AI is very good at generating essentially like scripts that you can use, for example, mass exploitation. So if you take like a new vulnerability that you need to, what they need to essentially like run exploitations for, they can speed that process up now because they just require like less time for coming up with like exploitation scripts and things like that as well. Something we also going to have is that there's going to be a lot more vulnerabilities discovered, and this is something that if you want to hear more about, you can kind of like look into our white paper as well. We have like some information there, but we built, based on all the years of data of security vulnerabilities, we built an AI system that is also capable of finding vulnerabilities, and we've already seeing it find CVEs completely independently. So the number of vulnerabilities that we are going to also find is not now anymore reliant on like the people actually going there and doing research, but we have AI that is capable of understanding the complete context of that software and finding security vulnerabilities like a static code analyzer would. Something, I don't know how many have you heard about Cyber Resilience Act? Like, yeah, well, not enough people. So this is a new law that was actually passed in November 12 last year. And this basically is like a GDPR for software security. So all the fines, everything like that is basically exactly the same as in GDPR, but it essentially, if you're a software developer, if you're pushing out software to the public, you essentially need to start having certain security measures in place, including vulnerability disclosure policies are becoming mandatory, releasing software updates. So for example, releasing security updates of a software separately from functional updates, this is going to be mandatory. And essentially the regulation is pushing you into whether you're a software manufacturer or if you're a software steward. So the open source software, for example, WordPress itself, needs to become a software steward. And that requires also a much more kind of like standardized governance. So the governance is going to be enforced also by the European Union, where we need to have more transparency, more democracy in leading open source projects, especially big ones like WordPress that is essentially having a major impact on the global web. And yes, vulnerability management is going to be very essential for every website. We already see that PCI DSS v4 for e-commerce websites included vulnerability management as a mandatory part. We see that in SOC 2. We see essentially vulnerability management and mitigation to become like the, I would say like the most essential security feature that you need in case you are hosting open source based web applications, and or if you are building open source based web applications, both because of the impact that it has in reducing the amount of incidents, but also because of the overall requirements from compliance. And and that's it. I hope you liked it. There's this QR code that is sending you directly into the white paper, where you will see all of that data. It's quite a long one, so take some time. And if you have any questions about what we do or want to secure CMSs, including WordPress, then meet our team at the booth H21.